Hybrid GR Sport, now in a much more affordable package compared to a Corolla Cross. Now, the engine for the Vios Hybrid, which is also shared with the Vios GR Sport, is actually very familiar. This is the 1.5-litre 2NRVEX engine, which again, we're very familiar with as far as the Vios is concerned. However, for the hybrid models, this runs an Atkinson cycle combustion, which means that it produces about 91 PS and 121 Newton meters of torque, which doesn't sound like a lot because, again, it runs on the Atkinson cycle. However, because this is a hybrid model, it is paired to an electric motor, which on its own produces 80 PS and 141 Newton meters of torque. Now, Toyota will not provide a combined torque figure. However, the combined power figure is 111 PS, which is 5 PS more compared to the non-hybrid model. Now, as a result, this does mean that this car is much more efficient compared to the non-hybrid model, as you'd expect. But because there is no combined torque figure, well, we'll just have to explain that to you in the driving portion. Now, the Vios GR Sport is actually a car that we've recommended very highly on the channel in the past. That's because the previous generation Vios GR Sport had a fabulous handling pack applied to it, as well as some refinements to the powertrain, which made this car a very attractive vehicle, not only for driving enthusiasts, but also for people who just want something that is perhaps a little bit more stable, particularly at higher speed. Now, for this new generation model, which was very eagerly anticipated, they have, at the very least, made this car look like a sportier model, as befits the GR Sport badge. So while, for example, we still get the same full LED headlights replete with automatic high beam, we now get a slightly different bumper treatment thanks to these additions to the bumpers on either corner, which help to emphasize this car's air intakes down here on the side, which help improve aerodynamics. The grille has also been changed with this honeycomb mesh in place of the usual slatting that you get for the Vios Hybrid. This piece here is also done up in black, where it is normally done in either chrome or a darker chrome depending on Vios variant, which means that from the get-go you can immediately tell that this is the GR Sport model, assuming of course that you've missed the GR Sport badge that sits over there. Now, as far as I'm concerned, this generation of Vios has generally been very well accepted, and it is a pretty good looking car to my eyes, and I think the GR Sport treatment has only helped to emphasize the fact that this car is pretty handsome. Now, down the side of the Vios GR Sport, as you can see, there have been certain applications made in order to make this car look a little bit sportier. So, if you were looking for a reason to buy the GR Sport over the regular hybrid model, if you ask me, the main reason ought to be the rolling stock, because the GR Sport runs 17-inch alloy wheels with a dual-tone finish to it, wrapped in Continental Premium Contact tires, which is suitably high performance for this application. The design of these wheels are also unique compared to the regular Vios G, because while they are similar in size, this one actually has a little bit of aerodynamic trickery to it in order to improve aerodynamics. As we move further down the side, we do still get side sills, and we also get a black roof application for the GR Sport model. Again, because it's meant to be a little bit more sporty, so therefore some sporty applications have been made to this. The other telltale sign is the fact that the chrome application on the bottom of the doors has now made way for some matte black plastic. Now, this is perhaps slightly less successful, depending on how you view things, but I would have much preferred this to be done in chrome. However, the fact that the Vios continues to retain that fastback-like profile, as well as little things like the rear skirting, as well as the rear spoiler that you can see from this angle, I do think the Vios GR Sport continues to look pretty good. Now, at the back of the Vios GR Sport, as I mentioned earlier, there are some GR Sport bits in order to make this car look a little bit more sporty. So, for example, we get a gloss black rear spoiler here, which is much more prominent compared to the one that you get on the non-GR Sport model, and we get some additions to the lower bumper in order to make this car look like it has a functional diffuser. It doesn't. Now, aside from that, we also get HEV badging up here, as well as GR Sport badging down here, as well as the number plate holders. This says Toyota Gazoo Racing Malaysia in no less than 3 different fonts. I happen to know that there was actually an internal argument over which design to apply for the GR Sport models in Malaysia in terms of the number plate holder. Unfortunately, the board decided that more words is better. To me, if you just put the GR badge in the middle, that would have been a lot neater, which I think we saw in the Supra. Or was it the Corolla hatch? Anyway, now, despite this being not only a hybrid but also a GR Sport, there is no compromise in terms of practicality in here. That's because the boot for this car remains as practical as it has ever been, and it remains identical to the Vios Hybrid. The only difference is that now the low voltage battery no longer lives in the engine bay, it now lives back here, which means that there is ever so slightly less space on one side. But I don't think it's really going to make that much of a difference. If you are a golfer, for example, you can actually fit your golf bags diagonally into this space. But if you need more space, unfortunately, the Vios GR Sport, just like the Vios Hybrid and every other Vios before it, does not offer folding rear seats. That's because there is a chassis brace that goes across the rear in order to improve this car's torsional rigidity that we get in our market because we're such keen drivers, which means that the rear seats cannot fold flat. However, there is at least a full-size spare wheel, which was something that was added 1 year after the Vios was initially introduced into our market because somebody on YouTube kept making fun of the fact that they didn't come with a spare tire. Don't know who that was. Now, the interior of the Vios GR Sport is a pretty nice place to be. Firstly, because they actually have a sunglasses holder, which I always appreciate. No, but beside that, I do feel that the interior design of the Vios, in this generation at least, has been pretty positive. So for example, we now get soft touch material here on the front of the dash with stitching that actually extends all the way out to the dash corners. We get more stitching and padded material down here. There's a little bit of gloss black plastic here, yes, but there is at least a texture to it, so visually it's a bit more interesting. And overall, I do find that the cabin of the Vios is just generally a positive place to be. Now, for the hybrid models, we also get a blue start button here, as well as extended ambient lighting via this strip here, because previously it was just a single bulb down here in this pocket, which I thought was just a bit naff. But now they've got this line here, and you can change the colors and the brightness via buttons here on the center console, and I think this is all generally quite alright. You also get single zone climate control, you get a leather wrapped steering wheel with GR badging down here, and this is always very nice to hold. You also get a digital instrument cluster with a screen on the left side and a digital speedo on the right, which is shared with the Prodo Ativa, and you also get a larger head unit for the hybrid models. Now, in terms of the operation of this head unit, it's not that bad because in terms of graphics and so on, it's pretty much acceptable. And more importantly, the around view monitor for this car is pretty acceptable as well. You have a bevy of different views to choose from. And as you can see, in terms of the render speed, it's actually not that bad, which means that behind this is a half decent processor. And I appreciate the fact that you can actually change the color of your Vios by pressing this button. As you can see, there's actually a variance where you can change the roof to, you know, body color or black, which is an interesting attention to detail. Now, aside from that, we also get wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which takes up the entirety of the screen. And as you can see, as it takes up the entirety of the screen, it does render pretty quickly. And even though this is a wireless connection, it is pretty reliable. One thing that I would like to point out is that if you want to use a wired connection, there is a single USB-A port here on the screen itself. Now, firstly, the cover for this has broken. Bear in mind, this car has only done 9,000 kilometers, so that's not a good sign, although bearing in mind the sticker up there on the front right corner, or top right corner, left corner of the windscreen, this car was also used as a test drive car during the KL International Motor Show, which means that there's no doubt in my mind that thousands of people have fingered this thing, which is possibly why it broke. But again, the reason why I bring up the matter of the USB-A port is because this thing is pitifully slow. Like, it won't even charge my phone when it's connected wired, so it's just not great. And if you do need a charge port in the front half of the car, good luck. Because while there is a wireless charging pad in here, there are no USB ports otherwise in the front half of this cabin. I've actually had to resort to putting in a sort of charger socket thingy here in order to keep my phone topped up, which is not great. Now, moving beyond that, in terms of ergonomics, everything falls very easily to hand. The steering wheel is also quite adjustable, not just for rake, but also for reach, which means that getting into a comfortable driving position is pretty easy. The digital instrument cluster is relatively easy to read, and of course, you have a bunch of physical buttons here in order to manipulate everything that you need to, which means that overall, everything is just pretty much okay. Now, talking about the GR Sport parts of this car, unfortunately there are very few because the majority of this cabin is just shared with the Vios Hybrid and therefore the regular Vios, which means that, again, gloss black plastic on the doors, but more soft touch materials where your arms are, but otherwise it's all hard, scratchy plastic. You do get GR Sport seats, by which I mean they are just the regular seats, but they are now upholstered in this sort of semi-leather, semi-microfiber type material in order to better hold you in place, which it does do pretty well. And you do get GR Sport logos embossed on the headrest, which is nice. You also get GR Sport foot mats or floor mats, but that's all. Aside from that, everything in here is just par for the course, which means that, for example, you only get 2 cup holders, one in front of each air conditioning vent, which is decent, I guess, because you can put a bottle in there and it stays cool. And of course, you can also put bottles in the doors, which are large enough for a liter-sized bottle. You have this cubby hole here, which is not lined in felt or rubber, which means anything you put in there will just rattle about. There's a small sort of little pocket here, which is, I don't know what that's for. And the center console, which is at least lined in a carpeted material and does hold the wireless charging pad, unfortunately is quite shallow. And I suspect that this is because it's had to make room for the air conditioning ducts as well as the wiring for the hybrid system. You also get a decently sized glove box here, which opens sort of very unceremoniously like that. But overall, I think this is perfectly acceptable for the price point that this car is at. If there is one little thing that I would have liked in this car, would have been a better use of soft touch materials, because while we get soft touch material here and here, like I demonstrated earlier, the tops, the door cards, and sort of the surround around the door handles are all hard touch plastic. And I just feel that even if there was fabric covering this hard plastic, it would have just been a little bit nicer. But again, not really too many complaints, given the fact this car is still comfortably under 120 grand. Is it something around there? I think this is still okay. Now, in the back of the Vios GR Sport, life is pretty good. I'm about 170 centimeters, and with the front seats that are in my driving position, I have a pretty decent amount of knee room and a pretty alright amount of headroom. It is a little bit tight, even at my height, but I think that generally this should be quite okay. More importantly, the rear seats have not been lowered in order to improve headroom, which means that you do actually have a very good amount of under-thigh support, and you can tuck your feet in underneath the seat in front of you. This seat base has also not been overly shortened, which means that, again, you do enjoy a decent amount of under-thigh support as an outer passenger. These seats are also quite scalloped, which means that you actually have a pretty decent amount of lateral support, and because we still have the same sort of leather and microfiber mix upholstery on these seats, it does mean that life is pretty alright back here. The center seat, however, is a little bit raised, although it's not that narrow, which means that you can actually park a bum here. Although the transmission tunnel is quite pronounced, which means that you will be fighting for foot space. But overall, I think this is pretty much all right. In terms of rear half amenities, you get a couple of crotch coolers, a pair of USB-C ports behind a very flimsy cover. You get pockets behind the front seats. You have door bins that are big enough for leaflets, as well as door sort of bottle holders up here, which is pretty much okay. I guess you could call these cup holders if you so want to. But again, in terms of material quality, it is exactly the same, which means that we have some soft touch material here with stitching, which is nice, but up here and here is all hard touch plastic, which is a bit unfortunate. But again, given the price point and given this car's direct competitors, this is basically par for the course, which means there isn't really that much to complain about. Now, the thing about the Vios is that it actually has a slightly longer wheelbase compared to some of its competitors, which means that if you're trying to fit a bulky rear-facing child seat, there is a little bit more clearance between said child seat and the backs of the front seats, which means that, again, it should be a little bit more accommodating specifically for that. And while the ISOFIX mounts in the rear are pretty easy to find, it is unfortunate there is no ISOFIX mount for the front passenger seat, because that would have improved sort of versatility in terms of where you want to mount a child seat. But overall, it is pretty much okay. However, the Toyota Vios has always largely been targeted at young adults or families without children, sort of that kind of in that mobility set, which means that for the Vios GR Sport, the emphasis is primarily toward rewarding the driver through the driving experience. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the Vios GR Sport in its previous generation was a model that we rated quite highly. Let's see if this new generation Vios GR Sport can actually keep up with the very, very big boots that it has to fill. Now, the thing about Toyota GR Sport cars is that the real appeal of them comes from the engineering chops that have gone into it and all the little sort of chassis refinements that have gone in toward making these cars feel a little bit more engaging to drive. Like, for example, the outgoing model had, improved suspension, improved braking. It also had an updated ECU and TCU, or engine control unit and transmission control unit. And the updated transmission control unit is what gave it the 10-speed CVT automatic gearbox, which I know sounds like a lot of gobbledygook, but in real-world applications actually felt like a much better gearbox setup compared to the standard CVT setup that you would have gotten in the regular non-GR Sport Vios. However, because the new Vios GR Sport rides on the HEV or utilizes the HEV hybrid powertrain, it does mean that some of the freedoms that the engineers would have had with the previous generation have not necessarily been extended into this car. So for example, the ECU and TCU on this car I don't think have been reworked at all, because from where I'm sitting, this car feels exactly the same as the non-GR Sport model in terms of throttle response, in terms of gearbox response, although there isn't really a gearbox for the HEV systems. But in essence, the way the powertrain responds to my inputs feels identical to the non-GR Sport model, which I find to be a little bit disappointing because the powertrain refinements are one of the highlights of the outgoing GR Sport model. But then again, that could just be me lamenting the fact that things are not as good as they used to be, that things used to be better back in the day, right? We have to get on with it and get on with the realities that now people want hybrid powertrains, and so a hybrid powertrain has been fitted to the Vios. Now, there are some benefits though from using a hybrid powertrain. Firstly, because the majority of your sort of initial acceleration and takeoff comes from the electric motor, it does mean that torque delivery is very smooth and a little bit more immediate compared to the non-hybrid models. So when you do put your foot down, the car gets up and goes a lot more seamlessly, a lot more smoothly, and a lot more urgently compared to the non-hybrid car. That is certainly an improvement. The other thing is the fact that because this car uses an Atkinson cycle engine, which basically means that you have much better thermal efficiency because the combustion stroke is a little bit longer in order to maximize the amount of energy extracted from a singular combustion point. Now, an Atkinson cycle engine normally has basically no torque. It's fine when you're trying to cruise at speed, when the car is only utilizing maybe 15 to 30% of the available power, but when you're trying to take off, when you're trying to accelerate, for example, that's where an Atkinson cycle engine really starts to feel a bit weak. Whereas because this car has an electric motor, that weakness is basically gone. As a result, torque delivery, like I said, is very urgent in this car, surprisingly more urgent than you might necessarily expect. Although, of course, Toyota, as I said, doesn't provide a peak torque figure, and I suspect that it's because peak torque in this car varies very, very wildly depending on the state of charge of the hybrid battery. But again, throughout my testing, I've done about 600 kilometers in this car. At no point have I felt that this car, or have I been made to feel that this car doesn't have adequate torque or adequate performance for what I need. So that is fine. But more than straight line speed, because that's never really been the point of Toyota GR cars, be it GR Sport or even the full-fat GR cars, this car's dynamic capabilities, however, are not to be scoffed at. So the suspension on this car has been reworked, and so it rides a little bit stiffer compared to the non-GR Sport or regular cooking model. And as a result, the Vios, which has generally been a relatively comfortable, relatively refined thing to live with, is now just a little bit better to drive. So for example, your primary ride feels a little bit stiffer, so when you go over undulations on the road, for example, it no longer feels like you're floating over the surface. Instead, a decent amount of information and feedback is actually coming through not just the driver's seat, but also the steering wheel. And so as a driver, you are now more aware of what's going on around you. It no longer feels that you're being insulated to death from everything that's happening underneath the car. Now, the other benefit of this slightly stiffer suspension is also that when you are, for example, attacking corners, taking B roads in and so on, this car's body control is now much better improved compared to the Vios. Now, because this car rides on the DNGA platform, it's not actually TNGA, because of the overall chassis rigidity, it does mean that body control in this car has actually been pretty impressive overall, but now it's been improved even further, making this feel like a much keener car to drive. As a driving enthusiast myself, or at least I'd like to think so, it means that when you decide to dive into corners, for example, this car just feels so much more confident as it goes about its business. The mechanical grip on this car has also been greatly improved as a result of that reduced or more controlled body lean. It means that this car is now able to fully utilize and fully maximize the continental rubbers that this car rides on in order to maximize mechanical grip. And as a result, it means that it feels like from the driver's seat you can do truly silly things from behind the wheel, because you can go around roundabouts or go through, for example, motorway on-ramps and off-ramps, and it just feels that this car will not throw in the towel. And because the steering wheel is very naturally weighted, it just feels like a really positive place to be as a driving enthusiast. It feeds in to that driving enthusiasm that you might have for this car, which is just great as far as I'm concerned. However, life in the Vios GR Sport isn't quite perfect, and that's because there are some shortcomings on this car which I feel are quite noticeable. The biggest gripe I have with this is actually refinement. Now, the Vios GR Sport is now based on the Vios Hybrid. Now, the Vios Hybrid that we drove was a decently acceptable, comfortable kind of car to drive. However, for whatever reason, the unit that I'm in, this particular car seems to be quite noisy. Now, the powertrain on this car, naturally, if you wring its little neck, obviously is going to scream and whine and complain, because this is, after all, an Atkinson cycle engine, which means it does have to rev quite high in order to not only provide the power that you need, but also to provide the necessary power to recharge the battery, which means that the engine is somewhat prone to whining and complaining if you do put too much throttle input any given time. But the worst offender to me, I think, is wind noise, which comes in at about 110 kilometers an hour, sort of around the A pillar and around the B pillar, which means it is very obvious to the driver. Now, I don't understand why that is, because again, the non-GR Sport model that I drove was perfectly acceptable, but for whatever reason, this particular car is now significantly less refined compared to that. Now, I suspect that one of the main factors for this is actually these stupid plastic vent cover thingies that they put over the windows. These are actually optional extras, but they seem to be fitted to every car delivered from Toyota, which means that whether you like it or not, this is what you're going to have to deal with. Now, I don't think that these accessories have spent that much time being refined in a wind tunnel, which means that in terms of its acoustic properties, I suspect that this is one of the biggest factors that is feeding into this car's lack of refinement at motorway speed, which I find to be deeply, deeply unfortunate. Now, that's just one issue that I have. The second issue that I have is this car's adaptive cruise control and overall Toyota safety sense application within this car. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Toyota Vios that we get in our market is actually built off of the DNGA platform, or Daihatsu New Global Architecture, not TNGA. And as a result, this car's ADAS system is very closely related to the ones that you would find in, say, Proto Myvi or an Ativa or anything else that runs the DNGA platform. Now, I bring this up because this system just feels a little bit janky. I'm sure it works very well in Japan, but it doesn't work very well here because it maintains too large a distance when you're using adaptive cruise control between you and the vehicle in front. And it likes to sort of react very jarringly. Like, it will slam on the accelerator as soon as there's any sort of meaningful gap, and then as soon as that gap closes, it will then very harshly sit on the brakes, which is just not a great place to be. It just makes it feel really unrefined and therefore reduces the likelihood of you actually utilizing those systems. Now, make no mistake, it is better in the hybrid. I suspect that this is because the ADAS system is only really working against the electric motor rather than having to fight the engine and therefore the CVT gearbox. And so adaptive cruise control, etc., is a little bit better compared to the non-hybrid models, but it's still far from great. And I think that for a Toyota, I would have expected a little bit better, given the fact that TSS in other models is really, really great to use. It's just unfortunate that this little thing is something that they have overlooked for this particular car. Now, this car does claw back a huge number of points as a result of that powertrain, because like I said, while it can be a little bit noisy when you're driving at motorway speeds, depending on what speed you're maintaining and, you know, that sort of thing, consumption, however, is without question excellent. So this car has been averaging about 20.2 kilometers per liter, which works up to about 4.5-ish liters to the 100, which is excellent for a vehicle like this, especially given the fact that I've not been driving this economically. I haven't really been using eco mode either, because the car defaults into standard mode rather than eco or power, which means that for the most part, this is how I expect the majority of consumers to drive this car, and the consumption numbers when driving it like that have proven to be very, very impressive. More impressively, however, there was one particular trip that I did, which was not in stop-start traffic, nor was it on a free-flowing motorway. It was your typical urban drive at typical urban driving speeds, where the car returned 30 kilometers per liter, or the equivalent of about 3.6 liters to the 100 or something to that effect. Which I found to be very impressive because, again, I wasn't exactly trying to drive this car efficiently. I was simply subjecting it to the same testing conditions that we subject almost every car we get on test. And so to be able to return such impressive consumption figures is, as I said, very impressive. Now, bear in mind that this is a car that will most likely be purchased by young families or upwardly mobile young executives, etc. These are the sort of people who will care about how much fuel their cars are consuming, because while they might be slightly better off than they used to be, that doesn't mean that they can be wanton and cavalier with their fuel bills. Which means that a vehicle like this being able to not only feed your driving enthusiasm, but also still be able to keep an eye on your wallet in terms of fuel consumption just feels like the best possible setup. And so I think that with this setup, this is going to appeal very, very widely to a bunch of people. To people who fashion themselves as driving enthusiasts, who are willing to spend a little bit of a premium in order to buy a car that is slightly better suited for enthusiastic driving, while again not compromising in terms of day-to-day practicality and overall fuel efficiency. This is what you want out of a car. While it might not be perfect, I feel that this is a sort of package that a lot of people will be able and be willing to live with. And I think that UMW Toyota was very, very right to bring in this car in this specification. That said, however, because the Vios is an incredibly popular vehicle, it might not necessarily appeal to the sort of people who want to stand out in a crowd. And so for those people, you'll have to buy an inferior car, like the MG5, for example, which is a pretty shocking thing, but at least it is decently good looking. Alternatively, if you spend more of your time on the motorway and less time in urban traffic, because I think that this car is very well suited for sort of urban sprawls and urban commuting. But if you spend more of your time on the motorway, if your commute is particularly far, or if you spend a lot of time doing long distance trips and stuff like that, then perhaps you might be better served by the Proton S70, because that car's turbocharged powertrain does mean that the engine sits at a lower RPM when you are cruising, which means that overall it is a little bit more refined when you're driving in that particular scenario. But if you ask me, as a jack of all trades, as a car that can do dynamic, enthusiastic driving as well as it can do urban driving, for a car that doesn't really need to be explained, I think the Vios GR Sport really hits the nail on the head. This is a car that's very easy to recommend, and I think that more and more people really need to consider having a hybrid Toyota in their lives, because I think that once you're used to this level of efficiency, while not really compromising much in terms of performance, it becomes very difficult for you to really consider anything else. In any case, that concludes our review of the 2026 Vios GR Sport HEV, or Hybrid. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.